The webinar is now live. I think, although I can't see our guests, I imagine that you are here, and thank you for being here to discuss the current show here at CPM, Figure Study, Dry Point Prints by Louise Bourgeois and Pooneh Maghazehe. Yeah, Zoom. I think we're all probably Zoom professionals at this point. I know the three of us are. I'm sure all of our guests are. And I was thinking about Zoom exhaustion a little bit, and how we've all done it so much, and in a sense how I'm appreciative of everyone who does take the time to join and to focus on a given subject. I think that might be one of the kind of unique things about Zoom these days, that people all decide to meet at a certain place at a certain time to talk about a certain thing, which feels pretty rare. And I feel lucky to be able to do that about this exhibition with Laurence Ross and Pooneh Maghazehe. So the show is straightforward. There's 4 dry point prints by Louise Bourgeois, 4 dry point prints by Pooneh Maghazehe. They are all figurative in one sense or another, and that's something that we're going to talk about more. And the way we're going to enter that conversation is through Laurence Ross's review that he recently wrote for Be More Arts magazine, which was beautiful and articulate and complex in a lot of the ways that I see this show and these works as being, and which would be very difficult for me to articulate, but I feel like Laurence did that really well, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So the structure of this Zoom event is going to be, we're going to do a short slideshow of about 20 slides, and I don't think I'm going to talk much, maybe a few words here and there just to show images of the works in the exhibition. Then we're going to do about a 45-minute discussion with Laurence and Pooneh, and then at the end maybe 10 minutes for Q&A. So there's a Q&A button that you can all press where you can put questions, and we'll look at those at the end and get to hopefully at least a few of those questions. So let's get to it. So let's do the slideshow. So as you can see, it's a sparse show, pretty minimally hung, in that every piece has a lot of space, and there's a lot of space between the works for the viewer to be able to fill, so to speak. Pooneh's prints were all made recently in 2021 and actually published by CPM, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit, but has been a great pleasure to do and to start this project with Pooneh. And really the exhibition grew out of this suite of 4 prints that we did together. And then the concept of pairing the works with Louise Bourgeois organically came out of that, which was a unique and interesting way to put an exhibition together. So these last few images, and maybe we could stick on this one for a second, are images of Pooneh's sculptures. So this is an exhibition from 2019 at Brennan and Griffin Gallery in New York. And obviously Louise Bourgeois is mostly known, or best known, for her sculptural works and installation works. Pooneh is also mostly known for her sculptures and installations. And so this is a part of the kind of dialogue that is happening of what's in these frames with these prints and what they represent outside of them within the scope of both of these artist practices. So we can move on, but these are a few examples of recent sculptures by Pooneh. Okay. So, Lawrence, maybe we can start the conversation again. Your review really addressed a lot of the ideas that Pooneh and I have been talking about over the last half a year, I would say. So we can start anywhere, but one thing I underlined is that you wrote is the ways a body transforms when it is studied, dissected, and experimented upon. That, to me, that's such an interesting concept of the viewing of a body actually changing what it is, or the representation of it changing what it is. Anyway, that's my first sentence.
Well, I think in that line that you pointed out, I was interested in that sort of clinical scientific way of examination that I think is very evident in the bourgeois prints, and then is evident by proxy since they're juxtaposed with Pooneh's work. So maybe that would be, well, I guess we'll start there, which is with like the lens, thinking about the lens of the viewer and who the viewer is. With an example like Bourgeois' hanging figure, which is sort of darkened on the outside, and it sort of looks like we're looking through almost like the iris of a predator. That's a sort of like predatory slit, if you will. That there's something malicious there, that there's something vicious there. And then I think your work sort of invites, at least impressionistically, a different type of viewpoint or access point, and where you sort of see that in conversation with bourgeois.
I think that's a great place to start. So this mentioning of the term scientific, and just pointing to a kind of observational method of recording a memory or an event, for me, it kind of frames this idea about distancing and a removal that has always been my way of kind of making work, or entering like an idea that is embedded in the things that I make. So this like kind of removal and it finding its way through a more scientific lens and deconstructing a thing that's in front of you. I'm interested in that resistance and how that resist can elicit a kind of desire or a kind of voyeurism or more suggested interest in what's happening. So that's one that is it's important for me to know, because it's kind of like an underlying framework for almost how I approach all the works that I make, or something that a theme that is consistent for me, at least it keeps me interested in anything that I'm making. In terms of the works that I am making or have made for the show, and my approach in terms of viewing or the viewer, as opposed to or next to the bourgeois prints, is that I imagine her works as sort of this first person narrative where it's a person, me, saying, this is my experience. I'm bringing you, confronting you with my space. Whereas for me, I would think of it more as this approach of the third person. So by comparison, it would be kind of the narrator being elsewhere and looking in on she or her or they or them. So this kind of like parallel between first and third person is a good way for me to just blatantly, like very clearly, identify the difference between the viewer through bourgeois works, and the viewer through my works.
I hadn't thought about before your work being sort of like third person point of view and the bourgeois as being first person point of view. And you use the phrase record a memory, which I think is interesting, because if we put those two concepts together, if your work is in like the third person, then you're recording the memory of a subject rather than self.
Yeah.
Which seems very in line with the prints that you made for this exhibition. And I think it's also the verb record, like to record a memory is also something like a recording you can watch over and over again. So that has me thinking about the idea of the editions and printmaking itself and sort of the process of printmaking itself. I wonder if you could talk a bit about or movement from the medium of sculpture to the medium of printmaking and with dry point prints, and maybe what you were trying to, like, what might you have been trying to preserve from the sculpture practice moving into these new works, and what might you have been trying to find or sort of discover in this new medium?
Well, I hadn't thought about printmaking as a medium at all until Vlad invited me to work on these prints. So
yeah, maybe I'll say a word. Can I say a word
Yeah.
about that
Yeah,
before you? Pooneh's work, her sculptural work for a long time has been dealing with the idea of duplication, multiplicity, doubling, mirroring. So basically like a subject representing itself and re-representing itself, duplicating itself. And a lot of that has existed in 3 dimensions, like most recently where a lot of works come out of the same mold, for example. And so for me, approaching Pooneh about this print project was to take this idea of multiplicity and have it be something that's inherent to the medium itself. And so, and then see where the ideas, like where the dust settles on the ideas within that medium. That's where I was coming from.
yeah. And the way I approached it was not very different from the way I approach casting many pieces from one mold, say, for example. So this practice of duplication through an imprint that is sort of consistent, or there's like a constant variable, to use a scientific term, is something that I begin with as a limit. And it's only from that point where I find the place of departure. I sort of rely on the limitation of a constant in order to find the departure, which is like, not a new idea. It's just like how I start a thing. In terms of how I went about the making the prints themselves, aside from how they're reproduced, I didn't use any of the traditional tools that are used for dry point printing, for one. And that's kind of it was it's not unlike the way I handle a lot of making in general. The majority of the skill set that I have comes from just methodologies that I've taught myself. And when I have needed to, I develop like a more technical skill set. If I need to weld really well, then I learned how to do that very well for the purposes of the thing that I was making. But when it came to these copper plates, when I got them, I used sandpaper, and I used a comb that I used to comb my cat with. And the rest of the marks are just kind of doodles in this print specifically. So, and those are materials or tools that I use in, say, making sculptures. So there wasn't any kind of like discrimination between which medium I was kind of making work from and which tool is necessary in order to work with that medium. It was kind of anything is up for like anything is like fair game, you know. So so I would say that it's kind of like I felt completely okay with how naive I was about making the prints. And so and what was interesting about it was like and frustrating was that, you know, I just didn't know what was going to come from it. I'm used to the immediacy that I can get from making like a three-dimensional object. I can make a gesture and I know what it is, but this sort of mystery was in not knowing what would come from a print. Kind of it was like this nice suspended sense of what was happening. You know, I guess that would be one way to start to answer that question.
Yeah, and if there's an element of like, I'm thinking now about the element of surprise that's implicit in that process,
Mhm,
and still in conjunction with the idea of memory and recording a memory.
mhm.
And there seems to be like a link there between the surprise one gets the end of the process of making
Yeah.
dry point print, as you're talking about, and how a memory is not a static thing. Like a memory is not.
Not. And
Uh,
and to add to that, the surprise is the proof. So the surprise is I mean, Vlad and I worked together. I was in my studio in Pennsylvania and Vlad was in Baltimore. So, and the printer was in New York. So when I would get the proofs in the mail, that was the first element of surprise. Mind you, it's also important for me to note that you know, these prints were made using sandpaper as a tool, which is very different from the proper tool used to actually make a dry point print, which meant that there was this unexpected limitation in how many prints we were able to get out of each plate. And that is works really well with this idea of memory, in that we have the first print, which is our surprise. And as the prints go on, the plate is compressed with each run, which means that that plate is removing some of those marks with each run. Not very obviously, but eventually the plate can't produce any more prints, which is not unlike this idea of sort of like the suggestions you make to yourself or the way you force yourself to try to remember something or you remember anecdotally over time. You know, this relationship to time, you know, details erase themselves. And the elements that you thought were most important are the parts that stay. So there's this kind of subjectivity that's interesting that happens with memory, but more importantly in relation to these prints, there's this erasure that is also very clearly a part of like how we operate as people, you know.
yeah, so now thinking about sort of the plates being compressed and what's happening with our memories as they, you know, as I guess as we grow older, and what stays and what doesn't. Virginia Woolf writes in her memoir that a memory, like that the memory that exists is whatever is significant, but we have no control over what is significant. So she remembers like this acorn tied to the blinds that's dragging across the nursery floor very vividly, but has no memory of the things that should be more exciting, like being thrown into the ocean by her father, which she hears through stories.
Totally. Yeah. That's so it's really close to how I think about just storytelling in general. When I think about like a memory like this, or the symbols that stay or the things that go, you know, like Diet Coke has a kind of banality attached to it. the doodles that I made in order to that ultimately, like 6 years, 7 years later, resulted in these prints, they were forgettable sketches. They were just things that you just write down to like record the thing that you saw, but not with this, monumental attention attached to it as this cataclysmic or very important event. So I really relate to that way of thinking through significance. It's something that I remember when I was in grad school, there was I had a critique, and the person who was doing the crit said to me, you really need to think about the economy of the symbol. And I was like, brain melt, But what he was just saying was, pay attention to what you're loading into the symbols that you use. That's all. And what does it mean when you use them? Like, that's really what he was saying, economy, like value, symbol, like, okay, significance. So yeah, that the term significance in relation to symbol making, there's a kind of forgettability that I really don't mind in the work, in the stuff that I make, like.
I wonder how that just makes me think a little bit of the difference with how Louise Bourgeois uses the figure as a symbol versus how you use the figure as a symbol, both like generally and specifically in these prints, and how it's a loaded symbol. I feel like you approach that question very differently. And one way that, Laurence, you were talking about is like is a presence versus an absence, where the Bourgeois prints, the body is a line drawing. The kind of the vulnerability of the body is explicit, whether it's in a state of pain or discomfort, or even grotesque at times. Whereas Pooneh's prints, the body is oftentimes embedded deep within the kind of imagescape of the print. I don't know if I'm veering off to a different topic. I was just thinking about the body as a symbol as well as a physical thing, and the difference between how you and Bourgeois are dealing with that in this show.
And the image of the body in Pooneh's prints is sort of layered under these different layers, but the image itself is a negative. Like, the image itself is the absence of the line.
Yeah, and that was built into my process. A lot of the way I deal with symbolism or symbol making is embedded in the way the works are made. So in those copper plates, for example, that figure, the figure itself is first, it starts as a little doodle that was maybe 2 inches by 2 inches. And I just blew this up 500%, however much, to make it the size of the plate, and had a vinyl sticker produced out of that doodle. And that was mailed to me. And that sticker is just what I put right onto the copper plate. And I sanded over the entire thing. So I have a sticker. I have sanded, the sanded negative space. And then I poured alcohol over the entire plate, which dissolved the positive. And what I was left with was that inverse. And so that elimination of the body is not unlike the content of the work itself, which has to do with a kind of, curiosity about place and placelessness, which are fundamental questions that are connected to sculpture as a medium, but also personhood. What does it mean to be somewhere and not feel as if you're not there? Or what does it mean to feel removed enough but connected? Removed, not apart, an eyewitness, but feel connected enough to have a very visceral emotional experience with what you're seeing. And so removal becomes just as important as mark making for me.
Which is thematically resonant with the whole idea of a diet.
Yeah.
Like the idea of
Yeah.
of removal or addition.
Right. Right. And so symbolically, the significance of the Diet Coke has to do with it's a real thing that is a part of our real world, but it takes up negative space, zero calories, which is such a wild idea. So this theme, like I over the past like whatever 5 years, I keep talking about the something nothing, and that's it. This soft drink is exactly that. It's something and nothing, which is reminds me a lot of kind of this experience of being somewhere, but not being somewhere and feeling validated in some way, but not having to necessarily feel as if you're in the room. So, which is like a very, like a deeper, more personal space that I don't necessarily need to explicitly render into the things that I make, but it's something that I'm comfortable talking about, you know.
Pooneh, could you share the story behind the image? Because I'm having all these connections with what you're
Yeah.
talking about with the actual, like, mini narrative that we
Yeah.
haven't really talked about yet.
So the narrative itself it's a story that I wrote, and it's about this morning that I was on the beach in Miami with a friend, and there was I was sitting on the beach, and about 20 feet away were a pair of twins, twin adolescent girls, and they were painfully thin. And it was about 9:45 in the morning, and I'm nosy. I love staring at people. That's why the beach is fun. Anywhere where people are, where I think it's, I don't know. I like staring at people. So anyway, I was staring at these people, and these two girls were sharing a Diet Coke, and one of them, they opened the Coke, the Diet Coke. One takes a sip, and then she passes it to her sister, and her sister takes a gulp, and then they hold it up to the sun and they measure it to make sure that each of them had consumed exactly the same amount of Diet Coke, which is really poignant to me. And then they held hands and walked over to a trash can that was an old oil barrel, which is like, what we see on the beach all the time for trash cans. And they threw it away. And then they held hands and just went into the beach. This whole thing was like no more than maybe 4 minutes. But it was so significant to me because it was just this the articulation of what sculpture looked like in my eyes. It was the fundamental definition of my relationship to object making. It's sort of this reliance between two individuals, whereas one person that is the exact duplicate of the other is consuming and measuring just enough as the other in order to confirm that both of them are here. They both have consumed the same amount of a soft drink that has 0 calories, which has its own, ideas, subtexts embedded in it. And then they throw it away. It was like this confirmation that they both are on equal level planes. And it was so beautiful to me. It was almost as if they relied on each other to affirm their own existence. And so and while in the act of consuming a beverage that was a soft drink, that was Diet Coke, clearly they were dieting, which is like has its other, like I said, subtext, but that was what happened. And so I made these really short little sketches, and then sometime that year I wrote something, and then I didn't make anything about it for about 5 years because I felt that it was so important that I just needed to wait to um, make anything from it. That's the story. And it's not a story that I think that I'll probably spend the rest of my life talking about, but it has themes in it that are really important to why I make work at all. And that's why I think I intuited that it would take so long to make work about it, and why I'm still talking about it. It's something that I really believe in right now. So
From post,
The image of
go
I
on,
was
go
just
on.
going to type the image of the twin girls passing back the beverage, the diet beverage, and measuring the beverage goes back to what Pooneh was saying in the beginning about that tension between resistance and desire,
mhm, mhm,
or like consumption and that paradox of consuming
mhm,
nothing.
mhm. And the active, there's a a suggestion as to, like, is it affirmation of being in a place while actively erasing. I think Vlad and I, when we talked about this, I brought up this idea of a cross cancellation, where it's sort of like it's like this geometric relationship of just two parts crossing over and canceling in their crossover.
Vlad, what were you going to say?
I was just thinking, I was thinking a little bit about how, again, about,
Vlad, are you speechless?
I'm totally speechless right now. Well, no,
Speechless.
everything you're saying, Pooneh, is like spiraling in me into like so many thoughts that I'm trying to keep straight in my head. But one of them is thinking about like how your personal symbology has the iteration that it takes in these prints, right? So these are images and ideas and stories that you've been working with for years, and how they've arrived in these prints is interesting to me in relation to how Louise Bourgeois used her in my view, like her printmaking almost as like a codex for understanding a lot of her other work, the sculptures, the installations, because you see a lot of the same imagery, but it's presented in this kind of field that is, it's kind of like a codex. I look at her prints as a way to decode, or a window into looking at her larger body of work. For me, it was a personal curiosity if that would happen with your prints for your sculpture. And I think in a way it does. I mean, some of the images we went through in the slideshow, I mean, there's literal repetition, whether it's of the Diet Coke, or even of that doodle of the girl that exists in particular sculptures. I think it was what slide was it? Slide number 24, maybe we can bring up. And then what it means for it to translate into this medium, because it's being replicated in the sculptures already, right? This is like, it's a kind of doubling down on what your practice is already doing. So it's one thing I've been thinking about while you were talking as well.
Yeah, there's a kind of mindlessness, or kind of like letting go of, or kind of like distanced psychological space that I indulge in. And that's why certain images or symbols reoccur in my work, and because I'm allowing for the indulgence. And like, for example, in this slide right here, there wasn't an overthinking, or a premeditated or a template way of putting down those lines. It was wet cement and just sketching into it. And I have that approach to a lot of the work that I make. And it's important to me because, they say a symbol is not they say, or I say, or it's just historically how it's ever worked. A symbol is just as important as the number of times it's replicated. It's always been a question for me whether an symbol is important by its replication or that it loses its significance by virtue of that replication. So like that inherent conflict is, very easily, obviously connected to why I might draw or make a symbol over and over again. It's constantly kind of positioning that question. Is this important or is it not if I'm showing it over and over again? It's almost like a question I'm asking myself, but it's obviously a question for the viewer. So
Yeah, it's interesting going. I was just thinking, so if one of these editions, there's only 10 available, right? But already like 500 people have seen an image of that print, right? So technology has developed this idea of the multiple way beyond the technology of printmaking. And so I think it's interesting to make a kind of a limited multiple in this almost antiquated way, or like historicized way. I think is another. It's such a particular choice with your work, which is interesting to me. Of like, yeah, we can make an infinite number of copies of that doodle. You printed the sticker, but to choose to align with a certain kind of history, which is also related to art and the history of printmaking, and it's representing other artworks, was one of its primary kind of goals, was to allow people to get an idea of an artwork that they couldn't physically go see. So, and so it's interesting to do that to your own practice here as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the only way. I mean, it's an old question. It's just the act of meaning making. I think that I'm consistently asking myself what kind of meaning a symbol might have to me, and whether it's worth it to say it again. And I think I just keep asking myself that question. And unfortunately, I'm like dragging my viewer through that process. But how else do you express value? It had value to me. And so its image will repeat itself, at least in my work for now. Until I can find something else to make a million things about, which will say the same thing for the rest of my life.
Well, I'm now thinking about the sort of process of repetition and the bourgeois print dismemberment in the show, where there is the figure who's sort of separated, her image is separated, her torso from her legs and her feet. So that type of sort of, like a clinical surgical separation versus the obviously much less horrific, at least superficially less horrific image of the measurement that's going on between the two girls on the beach. I don't know. There's something interesting in that dynamic between experimentation versus measurement.
Yeah. Oh, that end part went a different direction than I had anticipated. So is it experimentation versus, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, I'm just now thinking about the dynamic between experimentation and measurement, like that you're doing this work in a way that's this ongoing experiment with the image over and over. So in some ways you're manipulating this image, which made me think of this bourgeois print dismemberment, which is like this manipulation of this female body. And that there's some type of process in like a testing or duplication that you're doing
Mhm.
that there's a relationship somewhere between experimentation and measurement.
Yeah. Well, the measure is the limit because it's it has its own tangibility. Um, and the experimentation is sort of the spectrum between those, is the spectrum within that measurement. I like to think of it as a kind of book ending. I think Vlad and I talked about this too. It's sort of, I like to bookend my practice, I guess, and say, for example, like the mold that I might use to cast something from, that is the measured space. The experimentation is the fact that very often it doesn't even, the thing that I cast looks nothing like the mold that it has come from. And that's where there might be, where it may not be so obvious that there is kind of a kind of violence or a way that I'm approaching, say, like a mold or the act of making a thing. But there's like extreme manipulation and extreme dismemberment um, of the thing that of the medium that I'm using. It's just that it might not be as clearly legible as an image of a woman whose torso is distinctly, removed from the top of her body. But um, there's a lot of sort of subversive, manipulating, sort of very directed, you know, just, there's some dark content in my work. It's just that it's not rendered so explicitly. Um, like to this story that I'm talking about is very unsettling. It's just that the prints look like feathered rubbings, but it's deeply psychological,
Yeah, and I think
disturbing to be totally frank.
to kind of put a pin in this idea of deeply psychological, I think this is one kind of touch point or intersection point with you and Louise in this exhibition, even though you approach it so differently. Like the bourgeois prints are deeply psychological, but there's a kind of overtness about them. The way that they go into a psychic space is through an overt imaging of the body of the figure in a painful state. Whereas the way you're accessing your kind of psychological space is, it's like you're starting on the inside already. It's like you're bouncing around in an attitude about the body and a kind of perception, as opposed to like an internal perception somehow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about sort of broad points of entry, and I think about, what what can I make, or what move can I make to sort of get myself off the hook in order to say the thing that I feel that the work, or whatever, make the space for the work to say what it needs to say. And so when I think of broad points of entry, I think of that, just sort of this um, kind of peripheral, not so directed way of approaching um, anything really. I approach most things from the side, whereas these are very directed and confronting and point a finger. I'm more just kind of throwing my hands up in the air or something. I'm not pointing very directly. I'm kind of making these parentheses or something to hold something.
That might also, coming out from the standpoint of a writer, it's like that's the distinction, a distinction one can make between like a novel and an essay. Like the novel sort of directly telling a story, whereas the essay is a trial or an experimentation, which I think is much more akin to your practice.
It is, and it's also how I think about writing in general. Some of the things that I write are maybe 3 sentences, but carry a lot. So yeah, it's also connected to how I think about things when I write.
I wonder if maybe before we look at some questions from the audience, if we could just maybe end on Morning Sands 2 and look at that image for a minute, because we were, you and I were beginning to have a conversation I was very interested in, that it is slightly different from the rest of the work, and sort of tie that back to the idea of testing or experimentation that
Okay.
we were talking about.
You want me to speak to it a little bit?
Yeah, just about the sort of relationship with that image specifically, and this idea of, you know, testing, or as you just said, like throwing your hands up in the air, like
Yeah.
sort of that, how that all aligns.
Yeah. So of all of the four, are we going to put the image up and I'll speak to it?
Yes. Let's see which. It's the one on the left in slide 25.
I'll begin talking about it a little bit. So of the four prints that I made, there was one that was sort of experimentation. I had never worked with a copper plate before. And so I was trying out all these tools, and I was just doodling, which is not unlike the figures that the prints ended up depicting. They all started out as doodles. And so of the four plates that I made, there was one that was the plate that I experimented on. And so I made the duplicate sanded prints, and I kept one of the four, was the one that was sanded, but that I also experimented on. And this is that one. And something that I enjoy most about this print is that it really takes on the spirit of the kind of thinking that I'm talking about when I mention a kind of indulge in mark making, and a kind of play that allows for risks and new things to happen that may be unexpected, and it being the space where new content or new information, original thought actually happens. It's in these doodles, not these specific doodles, but it's kind of that thinking where you might notice something and then make an association that results in an original thought that may be specific to you, but may not have ever happened unless there was that kind of mindlessness attached to the way you were like in reality. And it's not like a dreamscape, but it's kind of like this being in a place and thinking about two things, and observing what might be in front of you and drawing something else. That's kind of how I treated this plate. It was very much kind of the way I experienced this story that I wrote. And it was important to me for that. And it ended up being one of the most complicated prints out of the suite. So that's a little description.
And I guess what drew me to you thinking, me sort of like learning about this particular print as in some ways the most experimental or the most test oriented, was particularly provocative when thinking about the narrative of the two girls and sort of the measuring of the amount of Diet Coke that's being drunk, and that it's actually, I think it might be too small to see it here, but there's sort of etched into the plate and then transferred to the print is like the year 2014 in reverse. It's sort of coming out of the can. And I was very interested in that idea of like consuming a year, or consuming time, or you know, that time being consumable in that way, but also, you know, 0 calorie in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
That's actually similar to so a few of these comments that have come in about the use of Coke as a symbol, and of Coke as being here. I'm going to just read one of them if you guys don't mind. Where is it? Well, there was one comment about how we quickly consume, the speed of consumption of signage and logos and things like that, and how that relates to the content of your prints. That's how I kind of read that. And then another interesting comment about Coke being used, actual Coke has been used as an etching material in prints, which
Like
is kind of,
cocaine or
no,
Coke?
like Coca-Cola,
Coca-Cola.
because it's high in acidic content. And I like that kind of pun quality. I think that's going on in a lot in these prints, right? So this story with the girl happened at the beach and there was sand and you're using sandpaper, or you're depicting Coke on a print and the Coke is acidic, so I think, we could spend another hour talking about some of the kind of language games that are being played very intentionally within these
Yeah.
prints.
Yeah.
And also,
I didn't know about the Coke part, but yes, yeah.
yeah,
Right.
generally speaking, and to go back to the whole exhibition, figure study is meant there's a kind of multiplicity of meanings in that as well, right? The study of the figure of the body, the study of the figure of the artist, and what it means to be, or whether it's generational difference between you and Louise. So there's all of these different ways to address these questions. But the few points that came in were about the Coke signage and how the cultural association of Coca-Cola, how that intermingles with the kind of narratives that you're playing out in your work.
Yeah, I mean it's an explicit choice, because that's a really, like I said, it's a really broad point of entry that I rely on. I'm taking full advantage of the fact that everybody's going to know what I'm talking about when I say Diet Coke. I'm not making a political statement about like the consumption of imagery. I'm just know that you're going to recognize Diet Coke when I use it. And it just so happens to lend itself to a lot of more deep-seated themes. It's almost like the Diet Coke is kind of the symbolism that I use on the waves on the top of the ocean, and then there's all this subtext that is lower, is deeper. But I rely on those waves because they crash and they make noise and they're shiny and you notice them first, like dangling a thing.
Yeah, one question from Kellen Coleman is actually talking about that sort of shininess. And he asks, are you concerned that by using such a recognizable symbol or logo, like with the Diet Coke, that the viewer will then rapidly consume the image as they would an advertisement, and perhaps sort of like miss those larger, more resonant themes you're trying to speak to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of like, that's kind of like a question of speed and legibility. Um, I I'm fully conscious of the speed at which someone might read it. I rely on that actually, because the rest of the ideas are slower. Um, it's to use a symbol that is always a loaded thing to do. So I'm not worried about it. It's If this was just about making a Diet Coke symbol, then I would just like make wallpaper out of it, make a room out of it or something. But I'm really deconstructing it, and by deconstructing it, I'm not letting it be what it is in its original form, which means that my manipulation is saying something else about it. So,
And then a figure study is a quick sketch, right? Like a figure study itself is like this quick
yes.
sketch that is representing the thing, but it's not a duplicate image of the thing.
Which is what also what I'm doing.
Yeah,
And is used in reference to do something else, like the figure studies used as a reference point to then.
Exactly. I mean, it's sort of like I was saying earlier, this idea of getting yourself off the hook. I'm using Diet Coke in order to say the thing that not me, but it's what the work is doing, which is not just about Diet Coke.
Yeah, and even figure study, like on the one hand, it's casual, it's a kind of preparation for something more important. But then to study it, it's all study is also to contemplate something, to ponder something, but it's like very serious. It's casual and serious at the same time. I think both of those things are kind of activated when you're using a doodle, which is quick, and then putting it through this process of time and energy to
Well,
become
yeah, I
an
mean,
artwork.
it's a question of like believability. It's monumental. It's monumental. How do you say the word?
Yeah.
Monumentality.
Monumentalizing. Is
Oh,
that a word?
yeah, I think so.
I think it's a word. It's making it important. Anyway, you know what I mean.
That tension between casualness and seriousness, I think, is also sometimes the way people engage in people watching, right? Like you're like
Yes. Yeah.
half paying
Definitely.
attention to it, but you're also really doing it.
Yeah, you're really doing it. It's I really like that kind of activity, this letting things sort of exist in whatever sort of humane, maybe silly way, but that there is like a very deep, more serious content attached to what's being seen or said.
That seems very human, casual and serious at the same time.
So there was one question about how we made choices for the specific bourgeois prints. That's a good question, because obviously Louise Bourgeois made so much work and she made a lot of prints, and really it was trying to dial in to kind of equalize the terms as much as possible, right? So all of the works are dry point etchings. They're made in exactly the same way, and they're all figurative, right? And pretty much have a soul figure involved. And so the idea was for it to be like a case study in a sense between these two artists with these very particular kinds of works presented in the space together. I mean, I don't want to sound too like nerdy about it, but so the choices were made with that in mind, not to make any kind of direct line or connection, but to have a room where the figure of the visitor is having to put the things together, and to have space for that to happen. Pooneh, I don't know if that sounds good to you, but
Sounds great. I agree completely.
so we have a minute left.
Close us out.
What?
What?
I say close us out.
Okay, I'll close us out. Or
Tell us how great we sounded tonight. Just kidding.
you two sounded so
Also
great.
compliments.
Well,
Yeah.
this is my compliment for both of you. I feel super privileged to, this show, as I was saying, came together in a really interesting way. And this conversation is kind of the bookend to the end of the show. And both of you, I've gotten to know through the process of thinking about these things. I mean, we have 1 hour on Zoom, which isn't the easiest kind of context to talk about fairly complex ideas, but I think you've done a great job of that. And I think it's, especially in these COVID times, to be able to all focus on something that we can mutually believe in, and that has made this amazing review by Laurence and this amazing body of work by Pooneh. I feel like for me to be floating in between there somewhere is amazing. And with these people that are joining this conversation, I hope you've gotten something out of it as well. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Thank you
Thanks
for
for doing this.
inviting me. And thank you, Laurence, for your wonderful review. It was so generous.
for
And everyone, by the way, read that review if you haven't yet. It's on Be More Art. The title is Tongue Twister, which I have here. Lawrence, can you say the title?
Corporeal congruencies.
Corporeal
Yeah, corporeal
congruencies.
congruencies.
So please do, because Lawrence brings up and goes into detail about a lot of the things that we've talked about here, and does a really amazing job. So please do.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank
joining.
you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.